There is a wound in you that never fully closed, and yet you have walked with it for so long that you no longer call it a wound. You call it who you are. You have learned to move around it, to speak without touching it, to smile while it quietly bleeds beneath your words. And no one sees, no one has ever seen, because you learned long ago that showing it only invited more pain. So you hid it. You wrapped it in silence. You buried it beneath years of ordinary days, hoping that time would do what love never did. But time does not heal what it is not allowed to reach. And so the wound remains, untouched, unwitnessed, unhealed, like a seed that was placed in the earth but never given water, like a river that was told it could not flow toward the sea. Let me speak of something you have carried alone for too long, not because I wish to open what you have tried so hard to protect, but because there is a kind of pain that only deepens when it is never named, and yours has been nameless for far too many years. You were not born expecting to be hurt. No soul arrives in this world with armor already in place. You came open. You came soft. You came like the first light of morning, believing that the world would receive you gently. You came believing that the hands reaching toward you meant safety, that the voices calling your name meant love. And for a time, perhaps they did, or perhaps they never did, and you only learned later that what you mistook for warmth was something else entirely. It does not matter now which came first, the trust or the betrayal. What matters is that something broke, not loudly, not in a single moment you could point to and say, there, that is where it happened. No, it broke slowly, the way a stone is worn by water, the way a tree bends under years of wind until it no longer remembers standing straight. It broke in the weight of words that were never spoken. It broke in the silence that followed your tears. It broke in the moments when you needed someone to see you and no one came. And so you learned. You learned that love was not safe. You learned that closeness was a door through which pain could enter. You learned that the softest parts of you were the most dangerous to reveal. And you began, without knowing it, to build. You built walls where there had been windows. You built distance where there had been reach. You built a version of yourself that could walk through the world without bleeding so openly, without hoping so recklessly, without needing so deeply. And this version worked. It kept you alive. It allowed you to function, to smile, to say, I am fine when you were not, to say it does not matter when it did. You became like a desert that had forgotten it was once a garden, like a river that had learned to flow underground, hidden from the sun, hidden from the sky, hidden from everything that might remind it of what it used to be. But something was lost in the building, something quiet, something true. You did not.
Notice it first, because survival has a way of silencing everything that does not serve it. But over time, the silence grew louder, and you began to feel it, not as absence, but as weight, as a strange kind of tiredness that sleep could not touch, as a distance from yourself that no amount of doing could close. You are not broken. You are protected. And there is a difference, though it does not always feel that way. The walls you built were not weakness, they were wisdom. They were the only response your soul knew how to give when the world proved itself unsafe. Like the cedar that grows twisted on the mountainside, not because it is flawed, but because it learned to survive the wind. Like the shadow that falls across the valley floor, not to darken, but to shelter what is tender from the harshness of the noon sun. Your protection was sacred. Your armor was earned. But walls that once sheltered can also imprison. And the armor that once saved you may now be the very thing keeping you from the peace you seek. I do not say this to blame you for your defenses. I say it because the wound beneath them is still waiting, still breathing, still hoping in its quiet way that one day you will return to it. Not to fix it, not to erase it, but simply to acknowledge that it is there, that it has always been there, that it has shaped more of your life than you have ever allowed yourself to see. And perhaps you have wondered in the quietest hours why you still feel so alone, even in the company of others. Why laughter sometimes feels like a language you have forgotten. Why the things that bring others joy seem to pass through you like wind through an empty room. This is not because you are broken, this is because part of you is still standing guard at a door that no longer needs guarding. Part of you is still waiting for the next wound, the next betrayal, the next proof that opening was a mistake. And that vigilance, though it once saved you, now keeps you from the very thing you long for most: connection, rest, the simple peace of being seen without fear. There's a kind of hurt that does not come from cruelty. It comes from absence, from the love that should have been given but was not, from the words that should have been spoken but were not, from the protection that should have surrounded you but never did. And this kind of hurt is harder to name because there is no villain. There is no moment of violence you can point to and say, that is what harmed me. There is only the quiet accumulation of what was missing, the slow erosion of trust, the gradual understanding that you were alone in ways you should never have had to be. Like a plant that grew in a room with no windows, reaching always toward a light that never came. Like a bird that sang each morning to an empty forest, never knowing if anyone heard. And so you adapted. You learned to need less. You learned to expect less. You learned to make yourself smaller, quieter, more acceptable to a world that seemed to only love you when you asked for nothing. But the soul does not shrink without cost, and the heart does not learn to expect less without also learning to feel less. And somewhere along the way, the protection became a prison. The safety became a silence. And you forgot what it felt like to be fully, unapologetically, recklessly yourself. Let me tell you something you may not yet believe. The pain you carry is not a punishment. It is not evidence of your failure. It is not the universe reminding you that you are unworthy of gentleness. The pain you carry is simply the weight of having loved in a world that did not always love you back. It is the residue of every moment when you opened your hands and they were not held, when you opened your heart and it was not received, when you offered your truth and it was not believed. Like seeds scattered on stone, they did not grow, but that does not mean they were not real. That does not mean they were not precious. And each of those moments left something behind. Not because you were weak, but because you were brave enough to try, brave enough to hope, brave enough to believe that this time maybe it would be different. And it was not. And so you carry not only the pain of what happened, but the grief of what you hoped for and did not receive. That grief is real. That grief deserves to be witnessed, not rushed, not fixed, not explained away with words that do not reach it, just witnessed, just allowed to exist, just given the space to finally, after all these years, be true. You did not fail at being loved. You were placed in gardens that could not grow what you needed. You were given soil that had no water, hands that had no warmth, voices that had no gentleness. And still you grew, still you reached, still you tried to bloom in rooms where no light entered. That is not failure, that is a miracle disguised as survival. And the parts of you that closed, that hardened, that learned to expect nothing, they were not weakness. They were the wisdom of a soul that knew it could not keep bleeding and still survive. Honor them. They brought you here. They kept the deepest part of you alive when everything else was trying to make you disappear. You have been told in so many ways that you should be over it by now, that the past is the past, that holding on to old wounds only gives them power, and there is a partial truth in this, enough to make you doubt yourself, enough to make you wonder if your pain is self-indulgence, if your grief is weakness, if your inability to simply move on is evidence of some deeper flaw. But let me offer you another truth, one that is rarely spoken. The river does not flow in a straight line toward the sea. It bends, it curves, it sometimes seems to turn back upon itself. And yet, it always arrives. Your healing is such a river. It knows the way even when you have forgotten. It returns you again and again to the same wounds. Not because you are failing, but because
each return brings you deeper. Each return offers you something you were not ready to see before. Each return is not a step backward, but a step inward. And the wound that you thought you had buried may simply have been waiting for you to grow strong enough to finally face it. Like a fruit that falls only when it is ripe, like a dawn that comes only when the night has done its work. There are parts of you that have never been held, not because they are unworthy of holding, but because you learned long ago that holding them yourself was the only option, that no one was coming, that the arms you needed would never arrive. And so you became your own comfort, your own parent, your own witness. You learned to soothe yourself in the dark. You learned to quiet your own fears. You learned to be enough when enough was never given to you. And this is not something to be ashamed of. This is something to be honored. Because the fact that you are still here, still breathing, still seeking, still open enough to be reading these words, that is not ordinary. That is extraordinary. That is the quiet triumph of a soul that refused to be destroyed by what it survived. Like a flower that grew through stone, like a star that kept burning though no one looked up to see it. But there is a loneliness in being your own everything, a weight that no one sees, a tiredness that no rest can reach. And there comes a time when the self you created to survive begins to feel like a stranger, when the walls you built begin to feel like a cage, when the armor you wore begins to feel heavier than the wounds it was meant to protect. And this is not a crisis. This is an awakening. This is the soul, after years of exile, beginning to knock on the door of its own heart, beginning to ask not for rescue but for return, beginning to wonder if there is a way to live that does not require so much hiding, a way to love that does not require so much fear, a way to be that does not require so much proof. Like the desert that begins to remember rain, like the winter that begins to soften toward spring, like the seed that begins to crack, not because it is dying, but because it is finally ready to become what it always was. And what if the very things you have feared were not obstacles to your healing, but doorways? What if the loneliness you have run from was the silence in which you could finally hear yourself? What if the emptiness you have tried to fill was actually the space where something new was trying to be born? The soul does not grow in fullness alone. It grows also in emptiness. It does not strengthen only in light. It strengthens also in darkness. The parts of you that feel most barren may be the very ground where your deepest roots are waiting to grow. Do not be so quick to escape what you have not yet understood. Do not be so eager to heal what you have not yet honored. Sometimes the wound is the teacher. Sometimes the darkness is the womb. Sometimes the very thing you have
called your brokenness is the door through which your wholeness will finally walk. I cannot promise you that nothing will ever hurt you again. That would be a lie. And the soul does not heal through lies, no matter how comforting they may sound. What I can tell you is something different. Something that may at first sound like less, but it is not less. It is more. It is the only truth that has ever set anyone free. And it is this: you are no longer the one who can be destroyed by what once destroyed you. Not because you have become stronger in the way the world measures strength, not because you have built better walls or learned better defenses, but because you have grown. Because the self that was wounded was a self that did not yet know its own depth. A self that believed that love was something given from outside. A self that measured its worth by how it was treated. And that self, though still part of you, is no longer all of you. You have become something larger, something deeper, something that cannot be taken because it was never given. It was always yours. It was always waiting. It was always there, beneath the pain, beneath the fear, beneath the endless trying to be enough. Like the mountain that remains still while the clouds pass over it. Like the ocean floor that is never troubled by the storms above. What hurt you before was able to hurt you because you had not yet discovered what could not be hurt. You had not yet touched the place in you that remains untouched by all the hands that failed you. You had not yet found the silence beneath the noise, the stillness beneath the storm, the self beneath the self, you were taught to be. And this is not something you need to create. It is something you need to uncover. It is not a destination you must reach. It is a presence you must remember. It is not outside you waiting to be earned. It is inside you waiting to be allowed. Like the seed that already contains the tree, like the night that already holds the dawn within its darkness, like the ember that waits beneath the ash for the breath that will call it back to flame. There is a part of you that has watched everything, every wound, every betrayal, every moment of hope, and every moment of collapse. And that part has never been damaged. It has never been diminished. It has only been forgotten, hidden beneath the layers of survival, buried beneath the weight of all you had to become in order to endure. But it is there, it has always been there, and it is not waiting for you to be healed before it reveals itself. It is waiting for you to stop running long enough to notice that it never left. Like the sky that is always behind the clouds, whether you see it or not. Like the silence that is always beneath the noise, whether you hear it or not. Like the ground that is always beneath your feet, even when you have forgotten to feel it. This is the truth that will change everything if you let it. You do not need to become invulnerable.
You do not need to build better walls. You do not need to learn how to never be hurt again. What you need is to discover the part of you that was never hurt to begin with. The part that watched, the part that witnessed, the part that remained whole, even as everything else seemed to shatter. And this part is not distant. It is not mystical. It is not something only saints and sages can access. It is simply the awareness that has been present through every moment of your life. The awareness that knows you are reading these words. The awareness that feels the breath moving through you. The awareness that is not your thoughts, not your pain, not your story, but the space in which all of it unfolds. Like the space in which the wind moves, but which is never moved by the wind. Like the stillness in which the river flows, but which is never carried by the current. Like the canvas that holds every color, but is stained by none. When you touch this awareness, even briefly, something shifts. Not in your circumstances, not in the people around you, but in you. You begin to see that the one who was hurt is not the only one you are. You begin to feel that beneath the wound, there is a ground that has never been broken. You begin to understand that the pain, as real as it was, as real as it still is, does not define the totality of your being. It is part of your experience. It is not the whole of your existence. Like the scar is part of the skin, but is not all the skin is. Like the shadow is part of the day, but does not eclipse the sun. Like the valley is part of the mountain, but does not diminish its height. And then you realize something that cannot be taken from you once it is truly seen. The pain was never chasing you. It was waiting for you to stop running. It was waiting for you to turn around and look at it, not with the eyes of the one who was wounded, but with the eyes of the one who can hold the wounded one, who can witness without being destroyed, who can feel without being consumed. And this is not detachment. This is not bypassing. This is the deepest form of intimacy. Intimacy with yourself, intimacy with your own history, intimacy with the truth of what happened and the truth of what remains. Like the earth that receives both the fallen leaf and the new seed. Like the night that holds both the dying star and the one being born. Like the sea that welcomes both the storm and the stillness that follows. Nothing and no one will ever hurt you again in the way you were once hurt. Not because the world has become safer, not because people have become kinder, but because you are no longer meeting the world from the place that could be destroyed. You are meeting it from somewhere deeper, somewhere older, somewhere that has watched 1,000 wounds open and close and has remained through all of it intact. This does not mean you will not feel pain. You will. This does not mean you will not grieve. You will. This does not mean that betrayal will not
sting, that loss will not ache, that the absence of love will not sometimes feel unbearable. It will. But there will be something different now. There will be a witness within you that does not crumble, a presence that does not flee, a knowing that this too shall pass, and that what passes cannot take what is eternal. Like the wind that passes through the cedar but cannot uproot what is deeply planted. Like the storm that moves across the mountain but cannot move the mountain itself. Like the wave that rises and falls but cannot drain the ocean. You have spent so long trying to protect yourself from the world. And that effort was not wasted. It kept you alive. It brought you here. But there is a protection deeper than any wall you could build. It is the protection of knowing who you truly are. Not the story you were given, not the wounds you collected, not the roles you played to survive, but the awareness beneath all of it. The silence beneath all the noise. The stillness that has never been touched by any storm. And when you rest in that knowing, something releases, something softens, something that has been clenched for years finally opens. Not because it is safe now, but because you no longer need safety in the way you once did. Because you have found something that cannot be threatened, something that cannot be lost, something that was always there, waiting for you to come home, like the river that finally finds the sea and realizes it was always water, like the light that finally breaks through the clouds and realizes the sky was never gone, like the wanderer who finally stops walking and realizes home was always within. The world will continue to be the world. People will continue to be imperfect. Love will continue to be imperfect. You will continue to be imperfect. And in that imperfection, there will still be moments of pain, still be moments of disappointment, still be moments when the old wound seems to open again and you wonder if you have healed at all. But you will know something now that you did not know before. You will know that the one who watches the wound is not the one who is wounded. You will know that the space in which the pain arises is larger than the pain itself. You will know that you can feel everything and still remain whole. Not because you are numb, not because you have escaped, but because you have finally touched what cannot be broken. Like the ocean that is stirred by every wave, but is never exhausted by any of them. Like the space that contains every storm, but is never torn by any of them. Like the silence that holds every sound, but is never shattered by any of them. This is not the end of your journey. It is not a destination you have reached where nothing will ever challenge you again. It is a beginning, a different kind of beginning. A beginning in which you walk through the world not as someone trying to avoid pain, but as someone who knows that pain cannot destroy what you truly are. And in that, knowing there is a freedom you have never felt before, a lightness, a willingness to open again, even knowing that opening always carries the risk of hurt, because you are no longer afraid of the hurt. You are no longer running from it. You are no longer building your entire life around avoiding it. You have found the place within you that can meet anything. And from that place, everything is different. Like the tree that has learned to love the wind because the wind has made it strong. Like the seed that has learned to love the dark because the dark is where it learned to grow. Like the flame that has learned to love the night because the night is where its light means most. You may still cry. You may still grieve. You may still have nights when the old sorrow rises and you wonder if you will ever truly be free of it. And in those nights, remember this: the sorrow is not your enemy. It is your depth. It is the proof that you have loved, that you have cared, that you have been brave enough to open your heart in a world that does not always honor open hearts. And the tears that fall are not signs of weakness. They are the rain that softens the ground. They are the water that allows new things to grow. They are the sacred release of everything you have held for too long, like the clouds that must empty themselves before they can rise again. Like the river that must give itself to the sea before it can be lifted back to the mountains. Like the tree that must release its leaves before it can welcome the spring. Nothing and no one will ever hurt you again in the way you were once hurt, because you are not the same one who was hurt. You have grown. You have deepened. You have touched the place in you that cannot be reached by any hand that means you harm. And from that place, you can love again. You can trust again. Not blindly, not recklessly, but wisely. From a ground that does not shake. From a center that does not collapse, from a self that is no longer dependent on the world being safe in order to feel whole, like the sun that gives its light, whether or not it is received, like the flower that opens whether or not anyone stops to see, like the mountain that stands whether or not anyone climbs it. The wound remains, it always will, but it is no longer a prison. It is a doorway to compassion, a doorway to understanding, a doorway to the kind of love that does not need perfection because it has learned to embrace imperfection, including your own, especially your own, like the crack in the stone through which the water finally flows, like the break in the shell through which the bird finally emerges, like the gap in the clouds through which the light finally pours. And so you stand now at a threshold you did not know you had reached. Not because you have arrived somewhere new, but because you have finally stopped long enough to see where you have always been. The journey was never about reaching a place of perfect safety. It was
about discovering that safety was never what you truly needed. What you needed was depth. What you needed was presence. What you needed was the quiet, knowing that you could meet whatever came and still remain yourself. And you have it now. Not as a possession you could lose, but as an awareness you could only forget. And even in forgetting, it never left. It was always here, waiting, patient, eternal. Walk forward now, not as someone who has escaped the past, but as someone who has integrated it. Not as someone who is invulnerable, but as someone who has found the vulnerability that cannot be harmed. Not as someone who will never feel pain again, but as someone who knows that no pain can take what is eternally yours. The night has done its work, the seed has cracked open, the river has found its way, and you, beloved wanderer, you have finally come home to the self that was waiting all along. The soul rests when it finally trusts itself. If these words touch something ancient in you, write,